"Please don't stop, sweetheart." The words slipped out before the man even realized he was speaking. He stood frozen near the food court inside Chicago's Union Station, surrounded by the usual chaos: rolling suitcases, echoing announcements, the sharp hiss of espresso machines. But none of it reached him anymore. His eyes were locked on one small table in the corner. A black girl, no older than 12, lifted an invisible fork to her lips. She smiled as if the food tasted warm. On the table in front of her were 2 empty plates, clean, carefully arranged. One napkin folded neatly at the side, just like she'd seen grown-ups do. She chewed slowly, politely, nodding to herself as if savoring a meal no one else could see. The man's chest tightened. His throat burned. He tried to look away, but his legs wouldn't move. The girl wiped her mouth with the napkin, careful not to rush, like she was afraid the food might disappear if she didn't respect it. People walked past her without slowing down. Some glanced, confused. A couple of teenagers snorted and whispered. A woman tugged her child closer and kept moving. To them, the girl was just another strange moment in a busy station. But to Elliot Crane, she was everything. His hands began to shake. This wasn't pity. This wasn't charity guilt. This was something deeper. Something old. The sound of a train horn somewhere in the distance punched straight through his chest, pulling a memory loose that had been buried for decades. A kitchen table. A flickering light. Empty plates. Elliot swallowed hard. He had spent 40 years building a life that didn't look like this anymore. Private jets. Glass offices. People standing when he walked into rooms. He had trained himself not to feel moments like this. Not to stop. Not to look. But now, standing in a crowded station with strangers brushing past him, he felt smaller than he had in a long time. The girl lifted her invisible fork again. That's when Elliot whispered it. "Please don't stop." The girl paused. Her eyes flicked up. For the first time she saw him watching. And something in her expression shifted. Not fear, not embarrassment, but caution. Like someone who had learned early that attention didn't always mean kindness. Elliot opened his mouth to say more. To explain himself. To apologize for something he hadn't done yet but somehow already regretted. But before he could speak again, the station announcement crackled overhead. And the moment, fragile as glass, hung in the air, threatening to shatter. Because the man standing there wasn't crying for the girl. He was crying for the boy he used to be. And he wasn't ready to admit why. Her name was Karis Bell, and she had learned how to disappear in plain sight. She sat with her back straight, feet barely touching the floor, hands moving with practiced grace. If someone didn't look closely, they might think she was just finishing a late lunch. That was the point. Karis didn't slouch. Didn't fidget. Didn't beg. She pretended. The empty plates in front of her weren't trash. They were borrowed. Returned to the same table every afternoon, wiped clean with the same napkin she carried in her backpack. She lined them up the same way every time because routines made things feel real. Today's meal was special. She imagined a roast on the bigger plate, juicy, steaming, cut into careful slices. On the smaller one, dessert. Something sweet. Something that reminded her of Sundays. She chewed slowly, eyes half closed. Not because she was playing, but because she was practicing. Around her, the station breathed and moved like it always did. Shoes scuffed. Luggage wheels rattled. Someone laughed too loud near the pretzel stand. Life rushed by without noticing the girl at the table. A man shook his head as he passed. A woman whispered, "That's sad," like sadness was something that belonged to someone else. Karis kept eating. She had learned early that stopping made people uncomfortable. Stopping made them stare. Pretending gave her control. What they didn't know was that she wasn't pretending to fool anyone. She was pretending to remember. She wiped her mouth again, folded the napkin tighter this time. She imagined someone across from her, smiling. Imagined voices. Imagined plates being filled again. Because this table used to be loud. Used to be warm. It used to belong to Mrs. Donnelly's kitchen, the little soup spot tucked near the station exit. The place where no one asked questions and everyone got seconds. The place where Karis had learned that hunger didn't mean shame. Until it closed. No warning. No goodbye. One day the lights were on. The next the door was locked. The sign gone. So Karis watched the table. Every day after school she sat there. Not because she thought it would magically reopen, but because empty spaces felt lonelier when no one remembered them. That's why she looked up when the man whispered. Not because he was rich. Not because he looked important. But because his voice didn't sound curious. It sounded broken. Karis studied his face for a second, measuring him the way kids who grow up fast learn to do. Then she smiled. The kind of smile that says, I'm okay, even when I'm not. And that's when Elliot Crane realized something that made his chest ache even more. This wasn't a game. This was survival dressed up as manners. And he was about to learn why the plates were empty. If you were Elliot Crane with all the money in the world, what would you do in that instance? Leave your comment below and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Elliot Crane had spent most of his life convincing the world, and himself, that hunger was something you outgrew. At 48, he was known across the Midwest as a man who didn't hesitate. The founder of a logistics tech empire that swallowed smaller companies whole and called it efficiency. His name appeared on conference banners, hospital wings, scholarship funds. The kind of man reporters described as disciplined and forward-thinking. No one ever said tender. Elliot stood there now in a tailored coat that cost more than most people's rent, his reflection faintly visible in the glass of a nearby storefront. He barely recognized the man staring back. Because this man was unraveling. He told himself to step away. To keep walking. He had a meeting in 30 minutes and a private car waiting outside. This wasn't his problem. This wasn't his responsibility. But his feet stayed planted. Karis lifted her imaginary fork again, and the movement hit him harder than any headline ever had. That motion. Slow, respectful, deliberate. It wasn't childish. It was learned. Elliot's jaw tightened. He had built his entire life on motion. On forward momentum. On never sitting still long enough to feel things like this. Feelings slowed deals. Feelings made you hesitate. And hesitation cost money. So he trained himself not to feel. Yet here he was, breath shallow, heart pounding, staring at a child who had somehow broken through every wall he'd built. He noticed details he couldn't ignore anymore. The way she kept her elbows close like she'd been corrected before. The way she nodded slightly after each bite, like she was thanking someone who wasn't there. The way she didn't rush, even though hunger usually made people desperate. That's when Elliot realized the truth. This wasn't pretend play. This was ritual. And rituals came from repetition, from need, from absence. The station announcement echoed again, but it sounded distant now, muffled by the rush of blood in his ears. He gripped the back of an empty chair, steadying himself as a memory crept closer. Not a clear one, just a feeling. Cold air through cracked windows. A table too small for the weight it carried. Silence pretending to be normal. Elliot shook his head slightly as if he could dislodge the thought. You're not that boy anymore, he reminded himself. That boy had grown up. Escape. One. He'd earned the right to forget. But the girl across from him hadn't. She glanced up again, eyes sharp but calm. Watching him now. Waiting to see what kind of adult he would be. Most adults disappointed. Elliot took a slow breath and finally stepped closer. Not as a billionaire. not as a savior, just as someone who remembered what it felt like to sit at a table with nothing on it and pretend everything was fine. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, the scrape of metal against tile sounding too loud in the quiet bubble around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And in that silence, Elliot understood something that scared him more than any failed deal ever had. The life he'd built was standing on top of a past he'd never faced. And this girl, this small, polite, pretending girl, was about to drag it all into the open. The memory didn't come all at once. It never did. It crept in the way hunger used to, slow, dull, impossible to ignore. Elliot was 8 years old again, sitting at a wobbling kitchen table on the south side of Chicago. The apartment was quiet in that heavy way that meant his mother hadn't come home yet. The plates were clean. Too clean. He remembered noticing that first. How strange it felt that dishes could be spotless and still mean something was wrong. His little sister sat across from him, swinging her legs, asking when dinner would be ready. She was 5, still young enough to believe answers. Elliot had looked down at his plate and done something that surprised even him. He picked up his fork. He pretended to eat. He chewed slowly, nodding like it tasted good. He told her it was chicken, that it was warm, that she should eat before it got cold. She laughed and copied him, lifting an empty spoon to her mouth. That was the night Elliot learned something important. That pretending could be protection. That manners could hide pain. That if you acted calm enough, the world might not notice how badly you needed help. Their mother came home late that night, exhausted, eyes red, hands shaking as she pulled grocery bags onto the counter. She froze when she saw the plates. "Did you eat?" she asked. Elliot nodded. He didn't remember her crying, but he remembered the sound she made. A soft, broken inhale that stayed with him longer than hunger ever did. That boy learned fast. He learned to be sharp, to be efficient, to never sit at empty tables again. He worked harder than everyone else, took risks others were afraid of, promised himself he'd never need anyone. And it worked. Until it didn't. Because standing in Union Station decades later, staring at Karis Bell and her empty plates, Elliot realized something he had never allowed himself to admit. He hadn't escaped hunger. He'd just outrun it. And now it had caught up. He blinked, the present snapping back into focus. The echoing station. The girl across from him. The napkin folded neatly between her fingers. Karis watched him carefully. Adults usually talked too much when they were uncomfortable. Or they talked down. Or they made promises they couldn't keep. Elliot did none of that. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, not because the room was loud, but because this moment felt fragile. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Karis nodded once. "Where's your food?" She didn't hesitate. "I already ate," she said simply. Elliot's chest tightened. Then she added with a small smile, "I'm just practicing for when it comes back." But the word hung there heavier than it should have been. Elliot frowned gently. "Comes back from where?" Karis glanced down at the plates, then around the station as if checking whether the walls were listening. Finally she looked back up at him. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty that made Elliot's stomach drop. "It belongs to someone else," she said. "And it didn't disappear by accident." Karis rested her hands on the edge of the table, fingertips barely touching the surface, like she was afraid it might vanish if she pressed too hard. "This table used to be loud," she said. Elliot stayed quiet. He'd learned that rushing kids only made them retreat. Silence, when used right, invited truth. "There were always people," Karis continued. "Bus drivers, night nurses, old men who didn't talk much. Kids like me." She smiled at the memory, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They'd sit here," she said, tapping the empty chair beside her. "Sometimes all day. Sometimes just long enough to warm up. Elliot followed her gaze. The chair was scuffed, the metal legs bent slightly inward. Used. Of. What was it called? He asked. Mrs. Donnelly's kitchen. The name landed softly but carried weight. Karis spoke it with respect, like you might say a grandmother's name. Or a church. They didn't ask questions there, she said. Didn't care why you were hungry. They just filled the plate. Elliot nodded slowly. He could picture it now. The steam. The clatter. The quiet dignity of being fed without explanation. So why are the plates still here? He asked. Karis shrugged. I bring them back. You do. She nodded. Every day after school. Elliot frowned, not in judgment but confusion. Why? Karis looked at him, really looked this time as if deciding whether he deserved the answer. Because empty places feel worse when nobody remembers them, she said. The words hit him harder than he expected. She explained how the kitchen closed without warning. One week it was open. The next, the windows were dark. The sign gone. No note. No goodbye. People came back at first. Knocked. Waited. Then they stopped. But I didn't, Karis said. Someone has to stay. Elliot's chest tightened. And you pretend to eat, he said quietly. She nodded. So it doesn't feel abandoned. Around them the station buzzed on. A couple walked past laughing. A train announcement echoed overhead. Elliot glanced around, suddenly aware of how exposed this moment was. How public. How fragile. Do you come here alone? He asked. Karis shook her head. Not always. That answer lingered. Who comes with you? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she straightened the napkin, folded it again, and placed it carefully beside the plate. People who need to remember, she said. Elliot swallowed. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about food. This was about dignity. About refusing to let something good disappear without a witness. And then Karis said the sentence that changed everything. It closed because someone bought the building. Elliot felt the air shift. Do you know who? He asked, already afraid of the answer. Karis nodded once. I heard the name on the phone, she said. Mrs. Donnelly was crying. She paused, then looked straight at him. It was a company from downtown. Elliot's pulse thudded in his ears. What company? He asked. Karis inhaled slowly. And then she said the name. Elliot didn't interrupt her. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe. Because the name she said belonged to him. Not his personal name, but the one printed on documents. The one embossed on glass doors and legal filings. The one people whispered with either admiration or fear. His company. The sound of it rang in his ears like a struck bell. For a moment, Elliot was sure he'd misheard. But Karis kept talking. They said it was for redevelopment, she said. Something fancy. Apartments maybe. Offices. She shrugged, the way kids do when they're forced to accept grown-up decisions they don't control. They said the kitchen didn't fit the vision. Elliot felt something inside him fold inward. Fit the vision. He'd used those words before. In meetings. In boardrooms. In emails sent without emotion. He'd never said them to a child's face. Around them, a few people had slowed down. Not enough to make it obvious, but enough for Elliot to feel eyes on his back. The energy had shifted. Something was happening. Elliot cleared his throat, but his voice didn't come. Karis noticed. Her expression softened, not with pity but understanding. Like she'd seen this look before on adults who suddenly realized the cost of their choices. You didn't know, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. I didn't, Elliot finally whispered. She nodded. Most people don't. That hurt more than anger would have. Elliot looked down at the table. At the plates. At the napkin folded like a promise. He thought about the deal. The numbers, the margins, the emails he'd skimmed and approved without a second glance. This was what they never showed you in spreadsheets. This was what got erased. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time the words came out broken. Karis didn't respond right away. She picked up her imaginary fork again, hesitated, then set it down. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Elliot asked. She looked around the station. At the empty chairs. At the people who didn't see her. "For someone to notice," she said. The crowd noise swelled, then faded. Elliot felt his chest tighten, the familiar pressure returning. Only now it wasn't memory. It was responsibility. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and stared at the screen. There was a number saved there he hadn't called in years. The one you used when you wanted to stop a process already in motion. The one that made people nervous. Elliot hesitated. Once he made this call, there would be no pretending this was a coincidence. No way to hide behind ignorance. Karis watched him carefully. Not hopeful. Just curious. Elliot's thumb hovered over the screen. Around them, the station seemed to hold its breath. Because the next thing he did would decide whether this table stayed empty. Or whether everything he believed about success would finally change. Elliot didn't make the call right away. He lowered the phone slowly, resting it against his palm as if the weight of it mattered now. Around them, Union Station kept moving, but not quite the same way. People were starting to notice. It wasn't obvious at first. Just small changes. A man slowing his walk. A woman pretending to scroll while glancing over her screen. Someone stopping near the coffee stand, eyes flicking between Elliot and the girl at the table. Moments like this had gravity. They pulled attention whether you wanted it or not. Karis felt it too. She shifted in her chair, sitting a little straighter, her hands folding together in her lap. Not nervous, alert. Like she knew when eyes gathered, things could go either way. Elliot glanced around, suddenly aware of how strange this must look. A well-dressed man seated across from a child at an empty table. His name wasn't famous to most people, but power had a look. And some people recognized it instinctively. A station security guard slowed nearby. Elliot felt a familiar instinct rise in him, the urge to control the situation. To stand up, end the interaction, move it somewhere private. But he didn't. Because privacy was how this kind of thing stayed hidden. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "How long has it been closed?" he asked. Karis thought for a moment. "A month? Maybe more." "And no one's helped?" She shook her head. Some people asked questions. Then they stopped. That answer carried more weight than she realized. Elliot nodded slowly. He could already hear the explanations forming in his head. Zoning issues. Contract clauses. Timelines. Things that made sense in rooms far away from here. But standing at this table, none of it sounded convincing. A woman nearby whispered something to her friend. The friend glanced over, frowned, then looked again, longer this time. Elliot exhaled through his nose. This was how stories started. And he knew something else too. Once people started watching, there was no such thing as a quiet choice anymore. Karis glanced at the empty plates, then back at him. "Are you going to leave?" she asked. The question was calm. Not pleading. Just curious. Elliot met her eyes. "No," he said. That surprised even him. She nodded once like she'd expected that answer. "Okay," she said. A train announcement thundered overhead, momentarily drowning out the crowd. When it faded, the space around the table felt smaller. More contained. Elliot looked at his phone again. He imagined not calling. Letting this moment pass. Convincing himself that caring right now was enough. It wasn't. Because Karis hadn't asked for sympathy. She'd asked for presence. And presence came with responsibility. Elliot straightened in his chair. "This might take a minute," he said quietly. Karis tilted her head. "I'm not in a rush." That was when he realized something else. She had never been. Elliot stood. The movement caught attention immediately. Chairs scraped. Heads turned. A few people recognized him now, maybe from news clips, maybe from instinct. He didn't step away from the table. He stepped closer to it. "I need to make a call," he said, not to Karis, but to the moment itself. He turned slightly, phone pressed to his ear as it rang. "What?" "Twice." Karis watched him, her expression unreadable. When the line connected, Elliot didn't bother with small talk. "We need to pause the redevelopment at Union Station," he said. There was a voice on the other end. Confused. Resistant. "I'm here," Elliot continued. "In person." Pause. "Yes," he said. "Right now." He listened, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the tiled floor. The explanation came quickly: deadlines, contracts, penalties. Elliot closed his eyes. "I don't care," he said evenly. "Stop it." The words landed with finality. A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd. Someone whispered his name this time. Someone else lifted their phone a little higher. Elliot ended the call and lowered the phone slowly. The silence that followed was heavier than noise. Karis looked up at him. "Did you fix it?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet." She nodded. "Okay." That calm again. That patience. Elliot crouched slightly so he was closer to her eye level. "I can't promise how this ends," he said. "But I can promise I won't walk away." That was the truth. Karis studied his face for a long second, then did something that surprised him. She slid one of the empty plates toward him. "Then you should sit," she said. "You're part of it now." The gesture was small. The meaning wasn't. Elliot hesitated, then pulled the chair back and sat down again. This time he didn't feel like a visitor. Around them, people were fully watching now. No whispers. No pretending. This wasn't entertainment, it was uncomfortable. Good. Uncomfortable meant honest. A woman stepped closer. "Is this about the kitchen?" she asked softly. Karis glanced at Elliot. He answered, "Yes." The woman nodded slowly. "My brother used to eat there." Another voice chimed in. Then another. Stories began to surface. Quiet ones. Personal ones. Elliot listened. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't leading the room. He was learning from it. Karis picked up her imaginary fork again, but this time she didn't pretend to eat. She just held it, waiting, because power had finally stopped moving long enough to see her. And now it had a face to answer to. The pushback came faster than Elliot expected. His phone buzzed once, then again, then didn't stop. He ignored it at first, focusing on the voices gathering around the table. Each story landed heavier than the last. A bus driver who used to grab soup before night shifts. A college student who studied there because it was warm and safe. An older man who hadn't missed a day until the doors closed. Elliot listened, nodding, absorbing it all. But the machine he'd built didn't like being interrupted. His phone buzzed again. This time he glanced down. The names flashing across the screen weren't surprised. They were alarmed. He stood slowly, stepping a few feet away from the table to take the call. "This isn't how it works," a voice snapped on the other end. "We're past that stage." "I know exactly what stage we're at," Elliot replied calmly. "You can't just reverse assigned redevelopment. There are partners involved." Elliot looked back at Karis. She was watching him closely, hands folded, expression steady. "I can," he said. "And I am." There was a pause. Then laughter. Sure. "You're reacting emotionally," the voice said. This will cost millions. Elliot exhaled slowly. I've spent 40 years making money, he said. I can afford to lose some of it. The call ended abruptly. Elliot slipped the phone back into his pocket, his pulse steady but his chest heavy. He returned to the table and sat down. Karis didn't ask questions. She just slid the napkin closer to the center as if making room. People don't like when things change, she said quietly. Elliot nodded. Especially when they're used to winning. He glanced around. The crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, it had grown. Not cheering. Not applauding. Witnessing. That scared him more than outrage ever could. Because witnesses remembered. A security guard approached, cautious now. Sir, he said, we're getting complaints. Elliot met his eyes. About what? The guard hesitated. About disruption. Elliot gestured gently to the table. We're just sitting. The guard glanced at Karis, then back at Elliot, uncertain. After a moment, he nodded and stepped away. Karis exhaled softly. They usually make you leave, she said. Not today, Elliot replied. But even as he said it, he knew this wasn't over. The machine didn't break just because one person stepped in front of it. It tested you first. And it was about to test him hard. The headlines hadn't appeared yet. But Elliot could already feel them forming. He'd lived long enough to recognize the early signs. Whispers turning into narratives, curiosity hardening into judgment. Doing nothing would have been safer. Doing something made people nervous. Another call came through. This one he recognized immediately. He answered without stepping away. You're embarrassing the board, the voice said flatly. Elliot glanced at Karis, then turned slightly so she couldn't hear every word. I'm correcting a mistake, he said. This isn't a charity case, the voice snapped. It's business. Elliot closed his eyes. That's the problem, he said. You think it's separate. The call ended. Elliot lowered the phone and sat quietly for a moment. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The station noise swelled and fell around them like a tide. Karis watched him closely. Are you in trouble? She asked. He considered the question. Yes, he said honestly. She nodded. That means it matters. Elliot smiled faintly. More people had stopped now. Some openly. Some pretending not to stare. A few phones were pointed directly at the table. This wasn't a private reckoning anymore. This was public. And public made powerful people uncomfortable. A man near the edge of the crowd muttered, "This is ridiculous." Another shook his head. Someone else said nothing at all, but didn't leave. Elliot looked at Karis again. You don't have to stay, he said. This might get messy. She shook her head. I always stay. Those words settled into him. This wasn't about saving a kitchen. It was about who got to decide what deserved to exist. Elliot straightened, shoulders back. He wasn't defensive anymore. He was resolved. Then so do I, he said. Karis slid the second empty plate closer to him, placing it beside the first. 2 plates now. 2 empty spaces waiting to be filled. Around them the crowd held its breath. Because everyone could feel it. This was the moment before things broke, or changed. And once that line was crossed there would be no going back. Elliot felt it before it happened. That quiet drop in the chest. That hollow space where certainty used to live. He sat back in the chair, hands resting on his knees, staring at the empty plates like they might start talking back. The noise of the station faded again, not completely, just enough to feel distant, like he was underwater. This was the moment deals usually broke. Not because of numbers, but because of fear. His phone buzzed again. This time he didn't check it. Across from him Karis sat still. Not tense. Not afraid. Just present. The kind of presence that made it harder to lie to yourself. Elliot had faced lawsuits before, media storms, threats from competitors. None of that scared him like this, because this wasn't about reputation. It was about identity. He had built his life on the belief that success meant distance, that if you stayed far enough away from the consequences, you could still call yourself a good person. Now the distance was gone, and what stood in front of him wasn't angry or demanding. It was a child who had learned how to be polite in hunger. Elliot leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and finally let the truth settle. "I didn't see it," he said quietly. Karis looked up. "See what?" "What my work was taking from people." The words felt heavy leaving his mouth, like he'd been holding them back for years. "I told myself I was creating jobs," he continued. "That growth always helped more people than it hurt." He shook his head slowly. "I never asked who got pushed aside." Karis didn't interrupt. She just listened. That made it worse, because excuses needed resistance to survive. "I could walk away right now," Elliot said. "I could let this go back to being someone else's problem." He swallowed. "And nobody would stop me." The station announcement echoed overhead again. A train arrived. A train left. Life kept moving, uncaring. Karis glanced at the plates. Then she looked back at him. "But you won't," she said. It wasn't a question. Elliot closed his eyes. "No," he said. "I won't." Saying it out loud felt like stepping off a ledge, because now there was no pretending this was a moment of emotion. No claiming he'd been caught off guard. This was a choice, and choices came with consequences. He opened his eyes again, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not confidence. Commitment. The kind that didn't guarantee a win. Just honesty. Around them the crowd stayed quiet. No cheering. No clapping. They weren't here for a show. They were here for the fall. And Elliot understood something then that made his stomach twist. Fixing this wouldn't restore his image. It might damage it. And for the first time in his life he wasn't sure he cared. "I didn't know," Elliot said again. This time it sounded different. Not defensive. Not explanatory. Just small. Karis studied him for a long second, her eyes calm but sharp, like she was weighing something invisible. Then she nodded. "Most people don't," she said. The sentence landed softly, but it cut deep. Because it wasn't forgiveness. It was observation. Elliot felt it settle into him, heavier than blame ever could. Not knowing wasn't the problem. Staying that way was. He glanced around at the people watching. Some looked angry. Some hopeful. Some simply tired. All of them carried pieces of a story he'd never bothered to read. "I should have looked closer," he said. Karis shrugged. "People don't like to look at things that make them feel bad." Elliot almost laughed at how true that was. He looked back down at the plates. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" he asked quietly. Karis hesitated this time. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But pretending keeps things alive." That sentence stayed with him. Pretending keeps things alive. Elliot reached for the napkin, straightened it, then stopped himself. He didn't want to take over the space. Didn't want to center himself where he didn't belong. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket again. Pulled out his phone. This time he didn't hesitate. "There's a call I need to make," he said. Karis watched him carefully. "A different one?" "Yes." He scrolled through his contacts, past names that represented power and control, until he found the one he hadn't used in years. "The one you called when you were ready to break something you built." His thumb hovered. The station seemed to quiet again, like it was waiting. Karis leaned back slightly, folding her hands in her lap. "Whatever happens," she said, "thank you for sitting." Elliot looked at her, surprised. "For what?" he asked. For not leaving, she replied. That was when it hit him. No matter how this ended, no matter what he lost or gained, this part mattered. Being seen. Being present. Elliot pressed the call button. As the line rang, his heart pounded, not with fear but with something sharper. Truth. Because the next voice he spoke to wouldn't just decide the fate of a kitchen. It would decide whether this moment stayed a memory or became a turning point that changed everything. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Crane, a man said, voice clipped like it was already annoyed. Elliot didn't waste time. It's Elliot. I need an immediate freeze on the Union Station redevelopment, every related permit, contractor schedule, and payment. There was a silence on the line, the kind that meant the person was checking whether this was a joke. Sir, we can't just. Yes, we can, Elliot said, calm but firm. If it's moving, stop it. If it's signed, pause it. If it's in motion, lock it. The man exhaled. Elliot could hear papers shuffling, keyboard taps, the quick panic that followed. This will trigger penalties, the man warned. Partners will call. The board will. Let them call, Elliot said. Behind him, Union Station kept breathing. Suitcases rolled. A train announcement snapped through the speakers. But around Karis's table, time felt pinned in place. Elliot walked back toward the table while still on the call, keeping his tone measured. I'm on the ground, he said. I'm looking at the consequences right now. You're going to help me fix it. Fix it how? The man asked, wary. Elliot's eyes flicked to Karis. She was sitting so still, like she didn't want her hope to make noise. We're reopening Mrs. Donnelly's kitchen, Elliot said. The man on the other end didn't respond right away. That's not a line item, he finally said. Elliot almost smiled at the absurdity of it. Then make it one, Elliot replied. I want a team on site today. I want a legal review of how we can reverse the closure, and I want a full report on who made the final call. Sir, the man said, voice lowering, that decision was approved months ago. It went through your office. Elliot's jaw tightened. I said I want the report, he repeated. The crowd nearby had fully turned now. People weren't pretending anymore. Some were close enough to hear pieces. Phones were raised, capturing the moment without Elliot's permission. He didn't care. This wasn't a performance. This was a reckoning. He ended the call and slid the phone into his pocket. When he sat down across from Karis again, she didn't ask if he'd won. She asked the question that mattered more. Did you mean it? She said. Elliot blinked. Mean what? That you're going to bring it back, she said. Not just say it. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. I meant it. Karis nodded once like she was accepting a contract. But then her eyes narrowed slightly and she leaned forward. You know people don't like when you change things, she said quietly. Elliot let out a slow breath. I'm starting to notice. Karis glanced toward the crowd. They'll talk, she said. They always do. Elliot looked around at the watching faces. Some hopeful, some skeptical, some angry. He'd built an empire on being untouchable. Now he was sitting at a child's table with empty plates in front of him, and the whole world felt closer than it ever had. A woman near the edge of the crowd spoke up softly. Is it true? You're the one who bought it. Elliot's chest tightened. He could ignore her. Slip back into privacy. Let the moment fade. Instead he answered. Yes, he said. And it was wrong. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not applause. Not celebration. Because powerful men didn't say that in public. Karis didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just looked at the empty plates again, then back at Elliot. Okay, she said. Then don't leave. Elliot nodded. But deep down he knew leaving wouldn't be the hardest part. Staying would. The backlash arrived like weather. Not a single strike, more like a pressure system rolling in. Elliot's phone buzzed again, and this time he checked it. Missed calls, voicemails, text messages that grew sharper by the minute. One from his head of legal, "This can't happen in public." One from his COO, "We have investors on the line." One from a board member, "Are you having some kind of breakdown?" Elliot stared at the screen, then locked the phone without replying. Across the table, Karis sat quietly watching his face. "Is it bad?" she asked. Elliot forced a small smile. "It's loud." Karis nodded. "Loud means they're scared." Elliot almost laughed. The way she said it, so simple, so sure, made it feel like a lesson he should have learned years ago. A man in a suit pushed through the crowd, walking fast. Too fast for someone who wasn't panicking. Elliot recognized him immediately. Blaine Mercer. One of his senior executives. Always polished. Always smiling. Always careful about cameras. Blaine's eyes flicked to the phones pointed at them, then to Karis, then back to Elliot. His smile tightened. "Elliot," Blaine said, lowering his voice as he leaned in, "we need to move this conversation somewhere private." Elliot didn't stand. "No." Blaine blinked, thrown off. "Sir, this isn't appropriate." Karis looked at Blaine calmly, then down at her plates. Elliot watched Blaine's gaze follow her, and something in Elliot's chest hardened. "Appropriate for who?" Elliot asked. Blaine's jaw clenched. "For the company. For the board. For the people who profit when nobody sees the damage," Elliot interrupted. Blaine lowered his voice further. "You're putting everything at risk. The redevelopment is already contracted. Pulling out will cost us. The partners will sue. Investors will pull." Elliot nodded slowly, like he understood every word. Then he said, "Good." Blaine froze. "Good?" Elliot looked around at the crowd. At the watching faces. At the small table that had become a courtroom without walls. "If doing the right thing costs me money," Elliot said, "then I should have been paying that price all along." Blaine's smile disappeared completely. "You're being emotional," he snapped, forgetting the cameras for a second. Elliot leaned forward, voice low and steady. "No. I'm being awake." Blaine glanced down at Karis again, then back at Elliot, and his expression shifted, just slightly. Like annoyance turning into calculation. "Do you even know who she is?" Blaine asked. Elliot's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Blaine hesitated, then leaned closer. "She's not just some kid," he said. "This is going to turn into a mess if you don't step back." Karis lifted her chin, eyes now locked on Blaine. Elliot's pulse quickened. Because Blaine wasn't warning him anymore. He was threatening him. And whatever Blaine knew about Karis, Elliot was about to find out the hard way. Elliot didn't respond to Blaine right away. He looked at Karis instead. She hadn't flinched, hadn't shrunk. She sat there with her hands folded, eyes steady, like she'd already learned something most adults never did, that fear loses power when you don't feed it. "What does that mean?" Elliot asked Blaine calmly. Blaine straightened, realizing too late that he'd said more than he should have. "I mean," he said carefully, "this situation is being watched. And if it turns into a story, it won't stay small." Elliot nodded. "Good." Blaine's eyes widened. "Elliot?" "No," Elliot said louder now. The word cut cleanly through the noise. He stood, not abruptly, but with intention. The crowd leaned in without realizing it. Phones rose higher. Whispers died out. Elliot took one slow breath. "My name is Elliot Crane," he said, voice carrying. "And I approved a deal that closed a place people depended on." A murmur rippled through the station. "I didn't see the consequences," he continued. "That's on me." Blaine reached for his arm. Elliot stepped away. "I'm not fixing this quietly," Elliot said. Because it wasn't broken quietly. He gestured to the table, to the plates. This kitchen will reopen, he said. Not as a favor, not as charity, but because it belongs to this community. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Did he just say that?" Elliot wasn't finished. "And until it does," he added, "no development on this site will move forward. I don't care who complains. I don't care what it costs." The silence that followed was electric. This wasn't a press statement. This was a vow. Kara stood up slowly beside the table. Not because she was asked to, because she chose to. She looked up at Elliot. "You said you wouldn't leave." "I'm not," he said. She nodded, satisfied. Blaine stepped back, face tight, calculating. "You're making this personal," he said under his breath. Elliot met his gaze. It always was. A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. A man nodded slowly. A security guard turned away, pretending not to see the phones. This moment would travel. Elliot felt it. And once it did, there would be no taking it back. Karis picked up the napkin, unfolded it, and placed it carefully at the center of the table. "Then this stays," she said. Elliot looked at the napkin, at the plates, at the promise he'd just made in front of strangers. And for the first time in his life, he felt something steadier than confidence. Accountability. Because now, if he failed, everyone would see it. The crowd began to thin, slowly, like people backing away from a fire that had already changed the air. But Blaine didn't leave. He stood a few steps away, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in sharp whispers. Watching Karis like she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. Elliot noticed. "Who is she?" Elliot asked quietly when Blaine ended the call. Blaine looked at him. Really looked this time. "You don't know," he said. "Know what?" Blaine exhaled, frustrated. "This girl, she's been coming here for weeks. People recognize her." "And?" Elliot pressed. "And someone recorded her a few days ago," Blaine said. "Pretending to eat. The video didn't go viral, but it almost did." Elliot's stomach tightened. "There are comments," Blaine continued. "People asking questions. Asking why the kitchen closed. Asking who bought the property." Elliot felt a slow burn rise in his chest. "So you were afraid of exposure?" he said. Blaine didn't deny it. "I was afraid of a narrative." Elliot looked down at Karis. She was kneeling by her backpack now, carefully placing the plates inside like they were fragile. Like they mattered. "Did you tell anyone to stop her?" Elliot asked. Blaine hesitated. That was enough. Elliot's jaw clenched. "Answer me." Blaine looked away. "We asked station staff to discourage loitering." Karis froze. Elliot felt something snap. He crouched beside her. "Did someone tell you not to come back?" he asked gently. She nodded once. "They said it didn't look good." Elliot closed his eyes. This was the part no one ever put in reports. This was how harm worked. Quiet. Polite. Clean. He stood up slowly and faced Blaine. "You didn't just close a kitchen," Elliot said. "You tried to erase the memory of it." Blaine stiffened. "We were protecting the company." "No," Elliot replied. "You were protecting yourselves." Elliot turned back to Karis. "You don't have to guard the table anymore," he said. She looked up at him, unsure. "Then who will?" Elliot gestured to the station around them. To the people who had stopped. To the phones. To the witnesses. "All of us," he said. Karis considered that. Then slowly she nodded. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of Union Station, the city kept moving. Deals were still being signed. Money still changed hands. But something had shifted. Because a little girl pretending to eat had forced a powerful man to stop pretending he didn't see. And from this moment on, there would be consequences. For Blaine. For the company. For Elliot. And for the table that was about to stop being empty. The doors reopened on a Tuesday morning. No ribbon. No cameras waiting outside. No speech prepared in advance. Just a handwritten sign taped to the glass that read, "Open, come in." Kara stood across the street with her backpack hanging off one shoulder, staring at the door like it might disappear if she blinked too hard. Elliot stood a few steps behind her. He hadn't slept much. The past 2 weeks had been a blur of emergency meetings, legal reversals, angry calls, and late nights spent undoing decisions that once felt invisible. Undoing damage was harder than causing it. The building looked the same. Brick worn smooth by time. Windows freshly cleaned but familiar. The smell, though, that was different. It drifted out onto the sidewalk before the door even opened. Warm. Real. Karis took one step forward, then stopped. Elliot noticed. "You don't have to rush," he said quietly. She nodded but didn't turn around. "I just want to make sure," she said. "Make sure of what?" "That it's real." Elliot waited. Finally, she reached for the handle and pulled. The bell above the door chimed. Inside, the kitchen buzzed softly. Pots clinked. Steam curled into the air. A woman behind the counter looked up and froze. "Karis?" she said. Karis smiled, this time wide and unguarded. Mrs. Donnelly stepped around the counter and pulled her into a hug so tight it lifted her feet off the ground. "I told you I'd come back," Karis said, her voice muffled. "I know," Mrs. Donnelly replied, eyes wet. "You always do." Elliot stood just inside the doorway, suddenly unsure of where to put himself. This wasn't his space. He didn't want to claim it. Mrs. Donnelly noticed him and gave a small nod. Not gratitude. Recognition. She turned back to Karis. "Sit," she said. "I already made something." Karis slid into a chair at the same table. Only now it wasn't empty. A real plate was set in front of her. Steam rising. Silverware laid neatly beside it. Karis stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork. This time when she lifted it, her hand shook. She took a bite, chewed slowly, closed her eyes, and smiled, not the careful smile she used before, but one that reached her shoulders, her breath, her whole body. Elliot felt his chest tighten. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to, because some moments deserved silence. The reopening didn't fix everything. Elliot made sure of that. No press release framed him as a hero. No campaign softened the truth. The company absorbed the losses. Projects were delayed. Some partners walked away. The board didn't forget. Neither did he. Elliot began doing something unfamiliar, showing up. Not to announce. Not to oversee. To listen. He visited neighborhoods he'd only seen through reports. Sat in rooms where people didn't stand when he entered. Asked questions that didn't come with answers attached. It was uncomfortable. Good. Mrs. Donnelly's kitchen became protected ground. Not owned by Elliot's company. Not branded. Not leveraged. It existed because it mattered. Karis kept coming after school, but she didn't guard the table anymore. She helped wipe it. Set plates. Talked with people who came through the door. One afternoon, Elliot stopped by quietly. Karis looked up from stacking napkins. "You're late," she said. He smiled. "Traffic." She studied him for a moment. "You still getting in trouble?" "All the time," he said. She nodded approvingly. "That means you're still doing it right." Elliot laughed softly. They sat at the table together. No empty plates between them now. "You know," Elliot said, "you changed more than a kitchen." Karis shrugged. "I just didn't want it to disappear." Elliot leaned back, thinking. He'd spent his life believing that impact came from scale, from size, from reach. But it hadn't taken a movement to stop him. It had taken one girl sitting at a table, refusing to forget. Outside, people passed the window. Some slowed. Some waved. Life moved on, but differently now. Elliot stood to leave. As he reached the door, Karis called out, "Hey." He turned. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "But you did." Elliot nodded. "So did you." She smiled. That night, as Union Station filled with travelers again, one table near the corner stayed full. Not because someone pretended, but because someone finally listened. A month later, Union Station looked the same. The same rush of footsteps. The same echo of announcements bouncing off high ceilings. The same blur of faces moving toward somewhere else. But the table near the corner didn't feel empty anymore. It wasn't always full. Sometimes only one person sat there. Sometimes none. But the plates never stacked untouched for long. Someone always came back. Someone always remembered. Karis passed through the station on her way home from school, backpack slung low, jacket zipped halfway. She slowed when she reached the table, not out of habit but awareness. She didn't need to guard it now. The table didn't belong to silence anymore. She watched a tired woman sit down, rub her hands together, and smile when a volunteer set a bowl in front of her. Watched a man thank someone without saying a word. Watched a kid her age laugh too loudly like the sound itself was food. Karis leaned against a pillar and let herself breathe. This was what she'd hoped for. Not attention. Not praise. Continuation. Across the station, Elliot stood near the entrance, unnoticed. No coat this time. No entourage. Just a man watching a place he almost erased continue to exist without him. That mattered. He'd learned something important over the past few weeks. Real change didn't need an audience. It needed consistency. He checked his watch and turned to leave, but stopped when he noticed Karis watching him. She raised a hand in a small wave. He returned it. That was all. No speeches. No promises. No explanations. Just acknowledgement. As Elliot walked away, someone else stepped into the space he'd vacated. Then another. And another. The table stayed full, not because of one man's decision, but because many people decided not to look away anymore. Karis slung her backpack higher on her shoulder and headed toward the exit. She didn't sit down. She didn't need to. She knew the table would be there tomorrow. And that was enough. There's a moment most people miss. It doesn't come with alarms or headlines. It doesn't announce itself. It's the moment when someone realizes they've been seen. Really seen. Not stared at. Not judged. Not pitted. See. For Karis, it happened at a table with empty plates. For Elliot, it happened when he stopped pretending distance was the same as innocence. And for everyone watching, it happened when they understood something simple, but uncomfortable. Most harm doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from silence. From walking past. From assuming someone else will stop. From thinking small moments don't matter. But they do. Because sometimes all it takes to change the direction of a life, or a system, is one person willing to sit down and stay. The table at Union Station still stands. Not as a monument. Not as a story people point to and say, "Remember when?" But as a reminder. That dignity doesn't need permission. That hunger isn't a failure. That pretending is what people do when they're waiting to be noticed. And that noticing is a choice. So the next time you pass something broken, something quiet, something easy to ignore, pause, sit, stay. Because you never know who's been waiting for someone to finally see them. And maybe that's what strength really looks like. Stories like this move you, stay with us. At Slush Stories, we tell them because they matter.